Wie geht's? Kultur in Zeiten des Coronavirus. Welcome to another international edition of Wie geht's, a podcast of conversations with people working in the arts, cultural policy, education and the creative sector, reflecting on how the COVID-19 crisis affects the cultural sphere. I'm Martin Zierold, Director of the Institute for Arts and Media Management at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Hamburg, Germany, which is producing this podcast. The title of this podcast, Wie geht's, has a double meaning in German. It translates as, how are you? We want to know how people in the arts are doing during these extraordinary and challenging times. Yet, Wie geht's also means, how does it work? On this podcast, we hope to share fresh ideas, learnings, stories, how we learn to rethink our practices and our role for societies as we try to come to grips with this crisis. In past international editions, we have visited a variety of locations ranging from various European countries to indigenous communities in the Amazon region. However, up until today, we did not take a closer look at the situation of the arts in the country with the most COVID cases worldwide, the United States. This will finally change, as my guest today is an expert on the situation of the performing arts scene in the US, and I'm glad that Alan Salzenstein has agreed to join me today. He is a full professor at DePaul University in Chicago, serving as the director of the Performing Arts Management and MFA Arts Leadership programs. Alan also is past president of the international academic organization Association of Arts Administration Educators, AAAE, and the international correspondent board member with the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. Alan has a long history of theatrical producing, holding executive director positions for various arts organizations over the past 30 years. He is a frequent invited speaker on topics related to arts administration and cultural management, having presented across North America, Europe and Asia, and is board chair of Classical Kids Music Education and was a long-time board member of the League of Chicago Theatres, among other organizations. Alan is also an attorney, focusing on issues related to the performing arts industry. I'm connected to Alan Salzenstein in Chicago via Zoom, as you do it these days. And we're going to talk about his perception of what the COVID crisis did to the American arts scene, and particularly the performing arts, and also how the teaching and the curricula of arts management programs might have to change in the future. But before we go there, the first question in this podcast is always very general. How are you, Alan?
How am I? Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you. That's, for such a simple question, it's such a complex one, especially during these times. I guess on a very superficial level, I am fine. I am doing well, certainly better than many. And yet it's a time that is, I think, not just frustrating and filled with anger, but it can't help, but affect an everyday attitude and perception. So, when I look a little deeper under the surface, I think I'm struggling. It's that great uncertainty.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I mean, most of our listeners will probably be in Germany, and we had guests from Brazil or from the UK, and always feels like you need to give some context about the situation. But of course, the US situation, the whole world is following that. So maybe we don't even have to talk about the health situation and the political sphere in the US. But just to give us an idea before we talk about the arts world of like your everyday right now, how's the situation in Chicago like? Are you able to go outside a lot? Are there restrictions? How are the case numbers in your area of the US?
Yeah, in my area, I think I'm one of the more fortunate ones as of this moment. As we know, things change, in mere moments. Where I am, we have a lot of restrictions, and we've had restrictions in place. So I think because of that, we're in a fairly good position now. There is a very slow rolling reopening of things. Of course, there are mandatory face coverings and social distancing, but in many places, there's still indoor dining, only outdoor, and with restrictions on capacity levels. So, so I'm feeling, I shouldn't say safe. I'm one that's actually more careful. I rarely go anywhere right now. And if I can do anything online or purchase anything that I need, I do it that way. I don't even go visit friends or family outside right now. I think it's still just, for me, the safest thing. I feel more comfortable. But I'm in a place geographically that is doing much better than some of the other areas in the United States. So I do feel fortunate, at least as of this moment when we're speaking. But of course, as you mentioned, the overall situation in the United States is just, it's unbelievable right now. I mean, it really is awful. And it's slowly spreading into all areas again. So I still think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better here.
Yeah, which is like a terrifying prospect. And at the same time, it seems very realistic based from everything also that you can read in the European news about the situation. I mentioned in the beginning, you spend a lot of your work life running theaters. And now you've spent already some time teaching how to run theaters and teaching arts management. And you've been the president of the AAAE, the Global Association for Arts Administration Education. So those will be the two fields we focus on. And if we start with the arts world, the arts practice, the arts professional field, there's a huge discussion in Germany and in many European countries that some feel the arts have been forgotten in all these bailouts, or at least not enough is being done to cater for the specific needs of the freelancers in the arts world, of the arts organizations. The US funding system is completely different to the German one, obviously. So how are the organizations and how are the artists doing, and how have they been doing over the first course of this crisis?
A lot of it in the United States is really based on geographical location. From the federal level, there's been very little to no assistance whatsoever for the arts, other than being put in the same position as any other business. So there have been some funding opportunities for businesses, mostly small businesses, although, of course, it looks like mostly the large corporations are receiving more of the funding. But for the individual artists and small organizations, it really depends on where they are. For example, in the Chicago area, it's been very much grassroots efforts. So some of the advocacy groups, as well as service organizations for theaters, for music, have created their own initiatives to just raise money. And while some foundations and corporations have stepped up a little bit, it's really mostly private donations. And even with that, the amazing number of artists that we have, and in Chicago, for example, theater companies alone, there's over 300 theater companies. And, if they get a few $100s or $1,000, how long will that really, keep them afloat? So it's actually, I think it's a very disastrous situation right now for arts organizations in the United States. They're really left to their own devices to figure out how to not just move forward, but how to survive until they can move forward. I'm currently chairman of the board of a very small arts organization that is based in Chicago, but it has worldwide reach. It's a group that performs with symphony orchestras around the world. We had an online fundraiser last night alone. And, like everybody else, it's just reaching to the individuals to say, we know you've been giving to everybody that you care for and care about, but here's another one. And it's really a tough situation. And I'm being somewhat pessimistic when I look down the road. We've already had many theaters close their doors permanently in the Chicago area, some well-known ones. And I'm expecting to see that to continue.
So how, looking forward, what would you think is a realistic scenario once the COVID crisis even allows for reopening? how much will still be left, and who will be left? What will be the criteria for those who do manage to get through the crisis? Is there something like a pattern of those who have the best chances?
Well, certainly we don't have many studies or research to go by, but I think looking historically at other types of crises, this is really going to be, I think, squeezing the middle. Out of where the smaller organizations, I think they actually have an excellent chance. It's still not only still being here, but doing well. They're scrappy. They've got the energy, and they also could promote themselves and continue on a very, small budget and not with a great many resources. The larger organizations, I think similarly, just because of the foundation of supporters that they have. While they have scaled back, one large organization that I work with, over I think 70% of their staff is either on furlough or have taken leave. They can continue basically to survive until that time comes. But the middle, those who are mid-sized organizations, I think they're the ones who are going to hurt the most and who might be closing their doors permanently. It's a tough position to be in when you're in the middle. Your expenses are much higher than you were used to when you were growing, and yet it's so competitive, especially in the private world, to get those donations. And I think what's most important, to be honest, when we look at the other side of this, and we say, okay, we can now go back into a community space. I'm not sure that the audiences will be there. And looking at, and granted, we're still very young in the research out there, but there have already been some studies done where the great majority of people, at least in the United States, who've been part of different studies, they will not be comfortable. And it's not only until there's a vaccine, but until, I don't want to say complete eradication of COVID, but where it's not part of our daily lexicon. And to me, we're talking then years to develop an audience again. So I am much more fatalistic than most, I think. I think that we are in for a very long period of time where we are going to be redefining and restructuring what we do in the performing arts. And I think that it goes beyond just opening the doors again.
Yeah, I mean, it relates to a very recent study for the museums that have reopened in Germany, where it's like the same result. In a way, one big part of busy are the schools who are not coming back yet, but another part are the private visitors, tourists who are not there even. But the locals also, like I see, they don't feel comfortable. So in a way, when the doors were closed, everybody was talking about this huge need to get back into the arts buildings in a way, even like to get back into the theaters, to the museums. But now that people can go back, like you said, some seem to be very hesitant. In a way, that might mean that those experiments that happen in the digital sphere will also be very important for a longer time, because if people aren't going back into the buildings physically, if you want to build your audience or keep your audience, that's probably the one option you have. In Germany, I mentioned that in a chat with you earlier. At the beginning, people were very happy to see how quickly museums, but also, and particularly in a way, performing arts groups went into the digital sphere, and they streamed from their archives. They streamed productions they planned anyway, or they did small things, musicians playing from the living room, actors reading or reciting text from the living rooms. The enthusiasm has receded in a way, and people now feel a bit like, okay, we've seen that, and where's the aesthetic value just beyond bridging the days when the building has been closed? How did that work, and where do you see potential in the digital sphere for this long time we're talking about, if we're talking about years, like you say?
That is a question that I am struggling with the most, to be honest. Because, when we think of, especially the performing arts and less so in the visual arts, you mentioned museums, and I think that there's there should be in most people's minds a difference between sitting within a confined space for the performing arts and dance and opera and theater versus the ability to walk through a gallery or a museum. So I do think that museums and galleries do have if you want to call it an advantage, but they do have the ability to at least attract people. It's a different level of safety and a different level of engagement. Looking down the road for the performing arts, I agree with you, and I see the same thing here in the United States, that people are basically now getting very, somewhat complacent and what was new to have online and streaming either archival footage or create, even orchestral concerts online, with some interesting creative methods. It's starting to get old, and I think people are realizing that. And I see that many organizations are just waiting for normalcy. So I don't see a lot of creativity beyond what we've already seen. I think that the closest in a way, and this is more, in places like where I am, where you are, we're lucky that we have nice weather right now. So more, I've seen drive-in concerts and, even some drive-in performances. But I think that, for places like ours, come the colder weather, when we're used to being indoors for the arts, I cannot imagine what arts organizations, how they can create content that is different than what we're seeing right now. In a way, it's just going back to the old radio play days. And, that might be it. Given the restrictions that we have in our lives and the level of confidence or the lack of confidence that people have to be around others, and for the safety of the artists too, I honestly cannot imagine what this new product can look like. I'm struggling with that.
Yeah, and maybe it would really need somebody with a different skill set in a way than the people in the performing arts to really imagine the digital sphere as a place for something completely different. So maybe it's very hard to, if you come from that background of the stage, to do something else than film your stage. Another question that we're struggling with, and the cliche of the US, one positive cliche looking at money at least, is there's ways to monetize everything. And if people had an idea, probably in the US they had an idea. So one thing we're discussing in Germany right now is those artists who are streaming, most of them are streaming for free. And a very important figure for the Hamburg Cultural Life, our Minister of Culture, said we'll be looking back at the COVID crisis and we'll be regretting that we didn't come up with a way of making people pay online. Because we're more or less doing the same thing again that the film industry suffered and the music industry suffered with the streaming services for free or the illegal downloading. When people got used to stuff online, you don't have to pay. Is there best case examples or what kind of examples do you have? Are people paying for digital services in the US more than in Europe? Or do you have the same issue that actually digital seems to be a free for all thing, looking at arts organizations putting their stuff online?
I've seen many examples of monetizing streaming work, or for a limited time having even live performance on via Zoom or some other platform where there is a fee associated with it. So I think some people are experimenting with that right now. It seems like many of the smaller organizations and even some of the larger theaters, now that I think of it, they are charging a fee for certain access. But the fee is very nominal compared to what it would be in a live situation. Between in US dollars, $5 to $25, I've seen some different admission, if you will. I think they're just beginning to try to figure that out, because the younger generation, I think, they're the ones who do see the digital world as free. So they're not necessarily going to pay even for some performing arts that they can get, access to. And the older generation, I don't think they're comfortable yet looking at this as a replacement for what they're used to. So I'm not sure, right now, even though they are, different organizations are monetizing what they have, I don't think the returns are that great. I think it's a way to test the waters a little bit.
Okay, yeah. So that's also not going to be the replacement for for the lack of funding in other contexts. One question we didn't have really look at right now is the social implications of the potential extinction, in a way, of huge parts of the arts world. I mean, obviously, it's going to be horrible for the artists and also for the people in arts administration. But is there a discourse on what society will lack if a whole country lets a proportion of their arts organizations simply vanish in a crisis like that? Because that also, I mean, in the public funding system in Germany, that's a huge debate. Can we afford to let our museums die? Can we afford to let our theaters die? And at least those who we expect to be for them, they voice their concerns and they say that they want to spend taxpayers' money in a way to rescue the theaters. Is there a debate on a broader level that society needs the arts, or is it really like an individual giving? And if not enough individuals give, well, then that's the market. Sorry.
Well, that's been the conversation and the debate in the United States for decades. So this current situation doesn't necessarily add to or take away from that discussion. I think that, that's something even in our classes with students that we talk about from day one, where at least in the United States, something that they have to always consider is, how do they defend what they're doing? How do they defend their career choice? And they, it's interesting because they do it with their parents, with their friends. And it's already the beginning of that lesson that they're going to have to justify the importance of the arts as long as they remain in the industry. And it goes well beyond their family and friends. And, in the United States, that's always been a very basic debate. So, in some ways, I think there's some optimism there, believe it or not, even coming from me, is that if you look at the United States as an example, where there has not been a great deal of governmental support for the arts, we haven't had the death of the arts on any level. So I think even if there is, great uncertainty about the future, I don't see it ever going away. There will always be movement of artists, from people who understand and need to be nurtured and nurture their soul with the arts. And that will still be there. So while I am fatalistic, it's to a certain extent. I don't see extinction.
Yeah. Well, that's an optimistic outlook, at least in the very general sense. So maybe it's gonna be like replacing things that go away with things we can't even imagine at this point. Yeah. You just mentioned your students, and it's the second thing where I'd at least like to take some time to talk with you about, is because you've been a teacher for arts administration now for quite a while, and you've been the president of the biggest association uniting and networking, bringing together people teaching arts management, arts administration worldwide, with a specific focus in the US and Northern America. I mean, I guess it's too early that curriculums have changed due to the COVID crisis, but I'd like to know whether you feel there's a need to rethink the way arts managers are trained in the future based on what we see right now, based on what we learn and the needs of the fields.
I think if you speak to many of my colleagues here in the United States, they would immediately reply with a very loud and definitive yes, we need to do that. I'm always much more cautious, and that's just me personally, and perhaps in my style of teaching as well. I think it's too early to make that decision, and primarily because we have to understand what we are training our students for. And right now, we don't know. So personally, as a professor, I can only teach what I understand, and I can only teach what my experiences have been, and what in some ways where I can adequately predict what's going to happen. But right now, with that great question mark out there, I think it's too early to make that determination. So I'm not saying that we need to just focus on everything we've been teaching in the past. A lot of it, and I would say the great majority of it, is still relevant, is still germane to what we hope our students will be facing when they leave school. But I think it needs to have some modification in terms of our current times, in terms of reflection, in terms of using our students to try to answer those questions that we don't have the answers for. That's how I'm going to be adjusting my teaching, is to really allow that space and that time for their participation in this process of change. Something that I don't usually do, to be honest. While I do incorporate their discussions, I'm always leading them somewhere. What I'm looking to do starting this fall is to collectively, all of us, lead together and follow together, because I don't have the answers. And frankly, they're going to be the leaders of our future. So hopefully they can start thinking that way. So while I do think that there has to be some kind of curricular modifications and adjustments, I don't think much of the content has to be changed. I think it's more about the approach and the style right now. Just a quick thing. I know that some of my colleagues are already adding, different components on crisis management and what to do in times like these, which I think is important. And I think it is possible to specifically look at certain case studies from the past. But again, I don't think it's, this goes beyond crisis. This is about a major shift in what we'll be doing. So I think it requires a different way for the students to engage and for faculty to allow that.
For me, it sounds a bit like that maybe is the most important thing to change, is to actually no longer wait for situations that we do understand, because maybe we're not going to understand the situation for the next decade or so, or even longer than that. So maybe it's this approach of being more back to like teaching as research, as collaborative research with the students, also to allow them to feel agency in situations of uncertainty. That might be a completely different approach of teaching in a way to classical curriculum design, where you define content and qualifications and then you try to deliver that, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but that's something where you see like that's only starting in a way in what you experience in most programs.
I don't even know if it's beginning, to be honest. What you're hearing are my own feelings for what I want to do. I think this next year is going to be very telling, and I think we'll be able to look back at this coming academic year as a real test on what are the best practices, because they will definitely be different than what they have been.
Yeah, so it'd be great, and that's one of the ideas of this podcast, if we can reconnect in a few months' time maybe and revisit what has happened since and how things have developed. For today, I think we need to come to an end. The final question of the podcast is also always the same. It's, where do you turn for inspiration at this point? It's easy to turn somewhere for desperation, I guess, right now. But where do you look for in order to find inspiration and maybe some kind of like feed resilience in a situation like the...
Another strangely, simplistic question that is very complex. I think it is very difficult to find inspiration right now. Clearly from my negative comments, you see that I don't always see the glass half full right now. But I think there's basic psychological need sometimes to look for what's comfortable and what at a good time in the past. So I might get ridiculed for this, but sometimes I look for old television from 30, 40, 50 years ago that just makes me feel good. That, in addition to something that did give me a little bit of inspiration last night, I mentioned this online fundraiser for this arts organization. It involves children, and just seeing and hearing the impact of the arts on children and it's not so much the innocence, but it's about the promise of the future. That still gives me inspiration.
I think that's a nice note to end this on. Thank you very much, Alan, for your time, for talking to me. And it actually would be lovely to talk to you again in a few weeks or months' time and see how things have developed in the US and more generally globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
This was the 49th edition of our podcast, Wie geht's? The culture sphere during the coronavirus crisis. We already have a number of English editions in the archive and will continue to produce more. All existing and future episodes in English can be easily accessed through our website, covid-culture.com, where you will also find links and further notes to each episode. Next week will mark our 50th episode, which will be in German again, I'm afraid. I'm looking forward to our next editions. Take care. Bis bald. Passen Sie gut auf sich auf.